Some photography purists use only a prime lens. They do no photo editing, but I find those images don't reflect what I see, or more importantly, what I feel. I've spent years studying human perception and how cameras capture images, and I want to teach you a very important and complex and advanced photography lesson. I'm going to show you interesting tidbits like how many megapixels the human eye has, but more importantly, I want to dig deep and help you create images that capture the feelings of a moment. First, I want to tell you about our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes websites. This is your web presence. This allows you to share your images, share your video, or tell the world about your business in a way that's so much more powerful than just social media. See, social media is filled with ads and distractions. It's controlled by somebody else to make a profit. Squarespace creates websites that are owned by you, that reflect your brand, that stay with you permanently no matter what. If this sounds good to you, head to squarespace.com/Chelsea. Try it out completely free. Share what you have with the world. And if you love it, use the coupon code Chelsea and get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. First, a question I get all the time, which is how many megapixels is the human eye? And the answer varies. Like some people will say it's about 7 megapixels, but they're reflecting only your center field of vision, where you actually have the most resolution, because in our peripheries, we might only have 1 megapixel of resolution, but that's not really the full answer, because key to understanding human vision is understanding how the brain processes what's coming from the eye. Our eyes are not fixed in a moment like a camera. They're constantly moving around, taking in the entire scene around us. And in fact, recent studies show that our brain remembers things for about 15 seconds and uses about 15 seconds of history to create an entire picture of the world around us. So you can think of it like a really long but intelligent long exposure. Now, of course, we can all see the difference between a 7 megapixel picture and a 100 megapixel picture. So clearly we're able to perceive more detail than just 7 megapixels. And in fact, studies show that you need more than 500 megapixels in an image if it were to fill your entire field of view, to make that image sharp enough where you can just look around and not see any lack of detail. As you can see, our eyes, our brains can consume a massive amount of detail, and this happens because of the really complex processing that's going on, because we look over at something to the side and our brain sort of takes a picture of it, remembers the textures, remembers the details, and then when we look over here, it's still filling in all those details in the periphery to create basically a panorama, but a living, constantly updated panorama. These gaps actually have some flaws in them. How many times have you seen some optical illusion online that tricked your brain and exploited these little weaknesses in human hacks? Or how about in every movie where there's a stunt double, but you don't actually notice because the movie showed you the actor's face and then showed a stunt double's body, but your brain just filled in the gaps. It just filled in the actor's face on this stunt double's body, because that is how much pure guessing our brain is doing. Here's a picture I edited to show how our eyes might perceive information if we didn't do that extra processing. You can see it's a picture of Chelsea, and she looks nice and sharp with lots of color information, but the background is kind of blurry and kind of desaturated, and then there's a big black hole there. You see, where the retina connects at the back of the eye is actually a blind spot that we have, but we don't perceive that. Just like we don't perceive our nose and our cheekbones until just now when I pointed it out. Our brain is basically using Photoshop's content-aware fill to fill in all of these empty spots. Our brain is also doing the most amazing video stabilization you can imagine. Try this. Take a camera, hold it against your forehead, and walk. When you watch the video back, it's going to seem incredibly shaky. It will not at all look like what you perceived. If you want to capture a video of somebody walking and have it look realistic, like the way we perceive it, you cannot simply use a camera. You would have to attach the camera to some sort of complex gimbal system to even it all out. In fact, that's what all filmmakers really do, because our brain is doing so much more work than just what the camera is capable of. Many people have asked me what the focal length is of the human eye, largely because they want to take pictures that replicate that human experience. And unfortunately, the answer just isn't simple. Now, Cameras do have lenses that they call normal lenses. And by definition, normal lenses supposedly reflect the human field of view. But I learned early on when I bought my first 50mm lens that this wasn't really the case. If you bring a 50mm lens on your next vacation and try to capture travel with it, you will find it's leaving out so much. In my own personal experience, looking at a beautiful scene, the Grand Canyon, before you, you do not capture a relatively narrow 50mm field of view. Instead, you can take in the entire scene, even though your eyes themselves actually are limited to a narrow field of view where things are sharp. Your brain, again, is stitching together this ultra wide angle panorama. Now, applying this to your own photography, this does not mean every picture you take needs to be super wide angle. In fact, if you're watching a bird feeder and there's a bird that lands in the tree, you focus your attention on that bird and everything else seems to disappear. If you were to take a picture of that bird with a 50mm lens, the bird would be incredibly small in the frame. It would not look at all like what you saw. That's because the human eye might be 50mm, but the human brain is essentially cropping in on the subject. The human brain is doing something you need to learn as a photographer, which is determining the most important parts of the image in front of you and cropping the rest of the world out. The easiest way to do this is with a zoom lens, which is why zoom lenses are so popular. I think if you were to ask me what the focal length of the human eye is, I would say maybe 12mm down to 200mm, because I often zoom in. When I'm talking to someone and they're across the table, I don't see anything but their face. I focus right in. And if I wanted to take a picture capturing my experiences at that time, I would zoom in. I would crop in tight so that their eyes really filled up most of the frame, because that is the way human perception works, even if that's not the way cameras work. As a photographer, when you take a picture, stop and look at the composition and ask yourself, is there anything in the frame that I'm ignoring? Because the viewer will perceive all the distractions, the branches creeping in at the edges of the frame, the person in the brightly colored jacket in the background. Your job as a photographer is to know that you're focused on the subject in front of you and blocking all of that out, but your camera is going to pick all that up. So you need to know techniques that you can use to get rid of those distractions. And for example, you might simply go into the background and move things so that they're not in the frame. You might change your position or zoom your lens so that those things are cropped out of the frame. You might decide in Photoshop to go in and remove those power lines that are ruining your landscape, because after all, you did not notice those power lines when you were standing in the beautiful scene, did you? But your camera captures them because it is literal, and your brain itself is not literal. You as a photographer have the job of replicating what the brain is doing in identifying the most important parts of the scene and filtering everything else out. If you want to create images that are realistic as a human perceives them, then sometimes that is not realistic as to how the camera captures them. Another huge gap between how we humans perceive and cameras capture is the fact that we see everything in 3D, whereas basically all modern cameras and the ways we view images are currently two-dimensional. This 3D understanding is really key because both of our eyes come together and focus on one thing, and that casts everything in front of or behind that subject out of focus. This we can simulate using bokeh on a camera. That's why I love this 85mm f1.2 look, because it is blurring the background out. You don't have to see the details of these fake bricks back here. If you were looking at me, if you were in the room with me, this is more like what you would experience than having the background completely sharp. But that's not always the case. If you're on vacation in Paris and you're walking past the Eiffel Tower and you're looking at the person you love, that Eiffel Tower and the person that you love are both important to the scene. And in those cases, you would need to understand that you would have to adjust the camera settings. You would have to use a high f-stop number and get everything in focus. It is not simply a matter of do you want the background in focus or not. It is a matter of understanding your own mind, your own perception, and saying to yourself, what am I perceiving now? How much of the background is actually significant to me, or is it completely insignificant? And then how do I replicate that experience in a still image that other people who are not immersed in this moment will actually view. Color is an interesting area because cameras actually perceive color very similar to the way humans do, because the sensor, the bare filter on the sensor, the red, green, and blue arrangement of photo sites, it's actually based on how the human eye works. So this is a pretty straightforward translation. I have a whole video on how all of this color stuff works if you want to watch that. But I will point out that it's not absolutely perfect. For example, our eyes perceive more blues in low light situations. The reds and the greens are the first bits of color that we lose in darkness. And that's why if you're editing a photo to appear as if it were taken at night, you would end up shifting that color a little cooler. Cinematographers know this. When they film a night scene, they usually do it under bright lights. And then in post-processing, they'll adjust the lighting to be a little bit cooler and a little bit darker. And that creates an image more like what human beings perceive. Even though it is not an image that is accurate to the camera, it is accurate to humans. I'm going to talk more about things like frame rate and dynamic range and shutter speed, as well as vision problems, like how being nearsighted relates to your camera. But first, I want to remind you about our sponsor, Squarespace, which makes incredible websites incredibly easy. You can create a beautiful website with your own custom domain just by dragging and dropping a few pictures in. I have northrupphotography.com where you can see all of my pictures. And when people say, oh, you're a photographer, where can I see your work? I don't send them to Instagram, where they might get ads from my competitors. I can send them to my proper portfolio, where images are displayed full screen, where they don't see comments from a bunch of people, where they see my best work, not just my most recent work, and maybe most importantly, it's not social media. I control it. If you're serious about your photography, you need your own domain and your own website, and you should start that journey at squarespace.com/Chelsea. It is completely free to try it out so you can see just how well it works. And if you love it, use the coupon code Chelsea to get 10% off. That's CHELSEA. Thank you, Squarespace. Last night was the full moon, and every month I have a reminder that goes off to try to find a place to take a picture of the full moon. It happened to be one of the rare days when we don't have clouds on the horizon and the moon was rising in a place where I could line it up behind my favorite lighthouse, the Ledge Lighthouse in New London, Connecticut. So I went down there at moonrise and looked through my camera at the moon rising behind the lighthouse, and it was absolutely gorgeous, but I was shocked because this is the first time I've done that shot with a mirrorless camera instead of a DSLR. And DSLRs have an optical viewfinder, so when you look through the lens, you are seeing what your eye normally sees. But with a mirrorless camera, I'm seeing what the camera sees. And I could really see the difference in dynamic range in that moment, because with my eye, I could see the lighthouse in front of the moon, but with the camera, the lighthouse was completely black. Because my eye has about 14 stops of dynamic range, but the camera typically shows you about 8 stops of dynamic range. Now, you might have heard that cameras can capture 14 stops in a RAW file, something like that. That is true. These RAW files have extra information that you can extract, and you definitely want to shoot RAW and learn how to process images with something like our Lightroom training books so that you can more accurately represent the dynamic range that the human eye perceives. So why doesn't the camera just show you all 14 stops of dynamic range whenever you take a picture? The answer is it would seem to be really, really washed out and low contrast. This, however, is changing with the introduction of what we call high dynamic range or HDR screens. A lot of screens, like including a lot of new smartphones here and a lot of new TVs, are capable of capturing detail in really bright parts of the image and really dark parts of the image. That is the dynamic range. And because these screens have more dynamic range, we can begin to capture and display more of that dynamic range. However, it's not common right now because you have to process the images or the video in a special way to be displayed properly on HDR. Because not everybody has these fancy HDR screens. As a photographer or videographer, it's kind of impossible to know how things are going to be viewed, and thus we pretty much still end up processing everything using the standard sort of 8 stops of dynamic range contrast scene. And when we do want more detail in the shadows or the highlights, we end up compressing things. by bringing the highlights down or raising the shadows up. These are very important techniques to understand that I can't go into detail now, but again, check out our Lightroom and Photoshop training to understand it. Dynamic range is something every photographer has struggled with. If you've ever taken a picture of somebody in front of a bright sky or in front of a sunset and they were just completely in silhouette, then you know your camera didn't capture what you were perceiving. Learn to shoot raw. Learn to bracket your images. Learn to bring them all together and process them in a way that looks realistic while displaying more dynamic range than is typical. And you will have unlocked one of the key differences between cameras and the human brain, and that will allow you to show images that are more realistic. Let's talk about shutter speed. To most photographers, they think of shutter speed in terms of what shutter speed do I need to freeze the motion, to make a sharp picture. But that is a beginner approach to take. A more advanced approach to take is to think about how much movement we as humans are perceiving in a given scene and then trying to find the shutter speed that most closely recreates that. Imagine you're a photographer for Road and Track magazine and your job is to capture the new Ferrari sports car driving down the highway. If you snap a picture at 1/4000th of a second, all motion will be frozen. Those wheels will be frozen. It will be very sharp, but anyone who looks at the picture will simply assume that the car was parked. That's because as humans, when we perceive a car driving down the highway, we don't see it as a series of sharp, still photos. We actually perceive the motion of the wheels. The wheels look blurred. Do this for me. Take your hand and wave it in front of your face. You will see it is not a series of very sharp photos of your hand, but actual movement of your hand. Now simulate a shutter in a video camera by blinking rapidly as you do this, and you'll be able to see a series of smaller photos, but they each indeed still have some amount of movement in them. There is a reason that cinematographers use what's called the 180 rule. This basically says that if your frame rate is 24 frames per second, your shutter speed would be 1/50th of a second. And as you might imagine, a car driving on the highway at 1/50th of a second shows a lot of movement. In fact, video in particular has a ton of movement in it. If you were to shoot video at 1/1000th of a second, it would end up looking choppy. And some cinematographers do this in action scenes to really sort of make them impactful and to almost seem like they're happening in fast motion. That's okay. But representing human perception accurately means using a slow shutter speed in many of these situations. And in my own work, I've been trying to get the shutter speeds down slower and slower, even in wildlife photography. When capturing flying birds, my rule used to always be 1/2500th of a second because I want to freeze it and make it completely sharp. That's not my rule anymore. Now I'm getting it down lower and lower, 1/500th, 1/250th, 1/100th. And that means that a lot of the pictures are completely useless because the bird is moving around and everything just looks blurry. But sometimes the picture turns out the way I actually see it, which is with the eye and face of the bird sharp, but the wings blurred as it's flapping, with the background blurred, because that is closer to human perception. And it is very difficult to replicate human perception with a camera, but mastering shutter speed is one of the key elements. Another key element to understand in human perception is frame rate for video. The standard for movies is 24 frames per second, and it has been since the beginning of cinema. The standard for TV, at least in the US, is 30 frames per second. But this video that you're watching is 60 frames per second, and we've been doing this for a few years. It's unusual, but the reason Chelsea and I settled on this is because we believe it is closer to human perception. Human perception does not work in individual frames though, because the eye is always processing information just continuously and then stitching it together sort of in real time. Thus, there is no frame rate you can tag to the eye. But if you're capturing it with a camera and you want to make sure that you exceed the eye's natural perceived frame rate, then you'd probably shoot at 120 frames per second. But 60 frames per second still feels much smoother than 24 or 30 frames per second. While Chelsea and I prefer 60 frames per second, some people find it disorienting. The fact is, as humans, we've all been raised on 24 or 30 frames per second video, and our brains have adapted to that. So while 60 frames per second is more like what we perceive, it is less like what we're accustomed to, and that's why some people find it a little bit off-putting. In the comments down below, I'd love to hear what you think the failings of cameras are in reproducing what we see and, more importantly, what we feel as human beings. Don't forget to subscribe for more free videos, and of course, check out our sponsor Squarespace, which makes beautiful websites with just a few clicks. You can get your own Squarespace website set up by heading to squarespace.com/Chelsea. Drag your pictures in, tell the world a little bit about yourself, set up your own brand, create a logo, get your own custom domain, everything you need to develop a brand for a business, your personality, your portfolio, or just a project that you're working on is waiting for you at squarespace.com/Chelsea. It's totally free to try out, but once you love it, the coupon code Chelsea, CHELSEA, will get you 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace, and don't forget, this is a podcast. You can listen to us while you're working out or editing photos by subscribing to the Picture This Photography podcast in your favorite podcasting app. Bye.